it's working. Okay, first time. See, I'm experimenting on you. So, Ruth is a lovely little book. It makes me think of some experiences I heard about when I was pastoring myself. So, the teaching was always going to be kind of the main emphasis in my life, but I spent 6 years as a full-time pastor up in northeastern New South Wales, up pretty close to the Gold Coast at a place called Murwillumbah. Any of you who ever kind of drove the Pacific Highway when it was the old Pacific Highway and kind of was wiggly, you might have gone through or just past Murwillumbah in those days, if you've ever been that far from Victoria. And like any kind of town, it had its kind of sad stories for some people there. And probably the saddest story I think I heard in my time was from a lady in the church who said she had a friend, a peer, so would have been, I suppose, in her senior years by that time, who had 3 sons, and the first son had committed suicide, and then the second son had kind of copycat fashion committed suicide after the first son, and then she'd lost the third son in a car accident. And so she was bereft of all 3 sons. And I just, whenever that returns to my mind, I have found it hard to imagine how you would ever recover from that kind of thing, and felt as though you would understand if a person with that kind of scale of loss would commit suicide or do something drastic themselves. It would be hard to feel that you had a reason to live. Now, that's a bit of a bleak note to start a whole talk on Ruth about, but we're going to talk about other parts of Ruth, it's the way it's shaped and things like that. But I really feel as though we couldn't understand the book of Ruth without feeling the gravity of the personal disaster that Naomi goes through. So sometimes because these things are reported in a compact way, in just a verse or two, we don't stop long enough to kind of feel them in our gut, But I really don't think we've understood Ruth, or we can really appreciate it properly, until we see the depth of the pit that she is in early in the story. And so we have to imagine her despair. Certainly don't want you to have to relive personal trauma if you've been through personal trauma, but some of you will have more cause than others to be able to understand that experience. We have to imagine the blackness of her despair before we can imagine what it is to be saved out of that situation. So we have to take time to feel our Bible stories, right? We have to take time to feel the scale of the emotion. It's not always despair. It might be a completely different emotion. That's an important emotion, I think, when we come to Ruth. Nevertheless, let me back up a little bit and make sure that this is, hang on a second, it's gone to sleep again, hasn't it? I'll have to just keep pressing it. Make sure it doesn't go to sleep. Okay, so it says it should be working. All right, I'll click. It's gone to sleep. So we need to back up for a moment and just briefly touch on introductory stuff. And so all we're doing at the front end is thinking about where the story is set. Many of you will understand that if you split Israel in half, and it did split in half, didn't it, later in its history, you would have what was called Israel up in the north, and you would have Judah down in the south, and that Bethlehem is kind of nearly in the middle of Judah. It's close enough to Jerusalem that in the stories about Jesus' birth, you could have flocks of sheep or goats kind of ready to be carted off to Jerusalem for sacrifice. So Bethlehem was really within view of Jerusalem. But if you look at a rainfall map of the land of Israel, it goes from moist up the top to drier and drier land as you go south until it's desert. And so as you go south from Jerusalem, the rainfall is slowly dropping, and you get to the point where agriculture is sort of no longer possible. So that helps me to understand how a place like Bethlehem can experience famine and drought, that if you just have a bad year, that rainfall line is kind of north of you and the grain won't grow, and it's a little bit marginal. There's stories told about South Australia that in some good years in the settlement days, they settled and tried to grow wheat too far north of a kind of a certain line of vegetation that gives away the sustainable part of crop growing land in South Australia. And so once the normal pattern returned, there were a lot of farmers who lost their livelihoods there. So we have these repeated stories in the Bible of people being driven out of Israel, being driven out of these southern lands especially, and having to flee to other places in famine. And that's much the case, what happened here. The judges, came before the kings. So we're talking about those last couple of centuries leading up to around about 1000 BC when, David and Solomon come on the scene, Saul and David and Solomon. And we know that later on, David is going to have some sort of connections with Moab. So if you remember when David's son Absalom rebelled against him, and David, emergency style, had to gather a few supporters and a few things and flee the country, the place that he sent his parents for safekeeping was Moab. So there was a sympathetic connection there that actually is, somewhat explained here when you see what's going on. In the time of David, and later on when Moab was an enemy, maybe it took some explaining to tell people how our king, the great King David, how is it that he has these kind of sympathetic connections with Moab? It's a bit suspicious now. It's a bit like the British royal family going back a couple of centuries having strong connections with Germany. And you can imagine at a time of conflict, there are big questions asked about that kind of thing. That, in my mind, is one possible motive for why you would need to write this story. You need to explain how could David's connections with Moab be a good thing? That might be possible. When you go later in Israel's history, first the northern kingdom falls, the capital Samaria, they're conquered in 722 BC, and then you get down to 586 and the southern kingdom finally collapses. This is centuries later. And then the people have this experience, the survivors, of living in Babylon and being outside their homeland and then eventually being able to come back. So this repeated experience of kind of alienation from the land, culminating in a really major experience in Babylon, might be a basis for why, if it's not when the story was written, it might be a basis for why it was really engaging and important to people. So one thing I noticed is just that Obed's name, he's the baby born at the end. In Hebrew, that just means serving. You could say serving as a slave or serving as a servant. It's a very humble kind of word. Now, it's not saying that Obed wasn't Obed's name, but all of these things are going to evoke connections for readers and listeners in those early times. And so if they had been exiled in Babylon and basically enslaved to Babylon, the name Obed, they would hear serving or being enslaved. That's the meaning that they would hear for that word, and they would be identifying with the story as well. All that said, Bible commentators really have no idea when Ruth was written or by whom. It's anonymous, it doesn't date itself. All it does is say, this happened back in the days when the judges ruled, implying they don't anymore. So it's at least in the time of the kings. This is back in the days when you had this custom of sealing a deal by taking off your sandal, it says in chapter 4. You only have to say that if that is not the done thing anymore and nobody knows the custom. So that's later as well. And it finishes with a genealogy of David, so it runs down 3 more generations. All of those things tell you it hasn't been written, 2 days after it happened. Quite some time has passed. We're talking about a story about, the fairly distant past. So something else that you won't normally see, I'm calling it the secret highlight, is that Ruth is a masterpiece of writing artistry. Now, the trouble is, it's hard for us to see that. It's a little bit like you showing a fantastic painting to someone who's colourblind and can only pick up 1 or 2 colours. They'll see some of the good artistry, and then other parts of it will be lost in that colour shift. So when you translate out of Hebrew into English or another language, you just lose lots of little bits of artistry that were very clever and also connected to the meaning of the story. So there's lots of little word plays, there's lots of sound things that an original listener in the same culture would have gone, oh, yeah, I get that. Oh, that's interesting. So a couple of examples. One is that, the kind of thing we can pick up. Naomi is regarded in chapter 2 as the person who's come under the wings of the Lord, right? That there's a certain word used for the wings of a bird or the edges of a garment. And so that word is used the first time. Naomi, by choosing to be part of Israel, choosing to be kind of a servant of the Lord in a way, she's come under his wings in that image. My daughter and I had that live stream of the Collins Street Falcon on the other day on YouTube. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at that. You can just Google it up. They've got a camera trained on this falcon high up on one of the Melbourne buildings. And yeah, no sooner did we look, the mother falcon's just there with the three chicks. It was about breakfast time, but a couple of the chicks looked like they were a bit like a couple of our kids, very reluctant to get up in the morning. And then there was one chick at the back who was actually a lot more curious about life, but could only get its head out because it was jammed behind its two siblings. So all you saw was mother with wings, two back ends of two chicks and the head of the other. So this word for wing, referring first of all to that action, Ruth, as it were, has come under the wing of the Lord like a chick under the mother's wing. But then it's the same word that she uses when she says to Boaz at the threshing floor, can you just extend your garment over me, the edge of your garment? Uses the same word. And so the original hearer would go, oh yes, connection, right? But it's hard to sometimes translate two different meanings of the same word with the same English word because we don't do that same thing with our words. In chapter 2, when she brings home a pile of grain, she brings home the quantity an ephah. I don't know how big an ephah is. I take it it's significant. But then when Naomi sees her come in with this bundle of grain, she says, oh, where have you been today? And she uses the word for where, ephah, right? So a listener would go, ephah, ephah. And in that case, it's just a little nice twist, right? It's not as significant, except that grain is a sign of hope in the book. So yeah, it is. It's still significant. It's not just a game. It's plugged into the meaning as well. So we miss some of those things, but you should be aware, writings like Ruth, professors of ancient literature around the world in the world's unis who aren't Christians will direct students to look at literature like we see in our Old Testament because it's amongst the best written literature from the ancient world. It's right up there. So it's very artistic, but it's artistry in the service of meaning, right? It's not just game playing, it's not trivial. It's actually artistry in the interest of communication. So that's a kind of a secret highlight that you might not realise. All right, so chapter 1's going to set us up. We start in Bethlehem, but immediately the action leaves Bethlehem under the pressure of famine. I've seen people talking about, was it wrong for them to leave? Did they do the right thing? Did they kind of too easily flinch and run away? I don't think we're really given enough room to make decisions about that. But one writer did point out that from Judah and places like Bethlehem on a good day, you could actually see Moab in the distance. In between's that really deep valley of the Dead Sea, the Jordan Valley. But over in the distance, you could have seen the plateau of Moab, and if it was in better shape than your land, maybe you could almost tell. The land between's pretty barren. But you could see where they went, and yet it's across a great gulf. But the flight did not produce the effect that was wanted, because why did they go? They went to be safe. What happened over there? All 3 men in the family died. It's left to our imagination to know why. We don't even know if it might be warfare or disease. We have no idea. It's up to the listener's imagination. But the quest for safety had come to nothing. And so Naomi ends up with the 2 daughters-in-law, but ends up with no men in the family whatsoever. In a patriarchal society where the inheritance is passed down through the males, that was a serious problem. Women alone, being left in the family, could be left disconnected from the property. Okay, so a really serious problem. So when Naomi comes back, and that's really where the story's ready to go. Like that early part where the daughters-in-law consider leaving, and then Ruth stays with her, that's kind of setting up for the main drama. That's really just the early scenes. And so Naomi is back, and she's greeted there in the marketplace, as we saw in the video. She's greeted, but she says, you know me as Naomi, don't call me Naomi anymore. The name doesn't fit. So the name, pleasant, or I've seen others translate it a little bit differently. It's a happy name, and she says, a happy name does not fit me anymore. And this is where I think it's important to feel it. We can't appreciate this story unless we realise that she is one of those broken, empty people. And she uses that word, empty. She says, I went away full. I was rich on the family front, and I've come back calm. I've come back empty. I've come back with nothing. And she speaks about the Lord as the one who has kind of broken her, embittered her life. So she really feels as if the Lord has it in for her, that this is kind of divine persecution. It's like all of the book of Job in one verse, right? That she actually feels, the kind of suffering I've been through suggests that God really was targeting me, really trying to make my life hard, really trying to rob me of anything of value. And so for her, when she hears the name the Lord, when Naomi hears Lord, it's not a good connotation. It doesn't fill her with joy. She now feels that she has become a victim of the Lord. She doesn't understand why, but that's how she feels. She's empty and she's facing the Lord's hostility, really. Now, when it mentions the barley harvest at the end, I think that's a hopeful sign. And because when I teach, I normally have audience interaction. Why is it hopeful? You can answer this one. Why is it hopeful to have the barley harvest mentioned at the end of chapter 1? Yeah, right. We were set up with famine, right? So if there's a harvest, there's a sign of change. Now, they came back because there was good news, but if we really appreciate how deep Naomi's despair is, then we are sensitive to signs of hope. And for there to be a barley harvest, that's a sign of hope. So things, they're very, very low, but they're looking up. And we're getting ready, not for a discouraging story, but for a very encouraging one. Okay, so first of all, we know that Naomi finds kindness in the field. And this is not to kind of take all the good bits from John and whoever's preaching later on. So I'm trying to dance across the top. But new scene, right, out in the field. And a bit like Esther, things that on the surface look like chance events we are going to appreciate as people of God are being kind of orchestrated. So Esther and Ruth, along with sharing, the fact that they're kind of short stories in form of writing, they also share this sense that God is behind the scenes managing the situation. They're not random events. So Boaz meets Ruth, and the signs are already good. When Boaz turns up on the scene, he greets his workers with "the Lord bless you." He sounds like a godly sort of guy. He doesn't have to say that. He doesn't have to mention the Lord. He seems to have a sincere connection with the Lord. And when he finds Ruth, he does more for her than he's obliged to do, doesn't he? So the Old Testament law, especially in Deuteronomy, actually requires people who own farms to see to it that there's some grain left available for the really destitute people who need to come and scavenge the grain off the ground. Don't harvest your land right to the corners. If you drop grain on the ground, don't go back and pick it up. Just make sure there's something for the really destitute person with no means of living to scrape up some kind of sustenance. But Boaz goes beyond that because he makes sure, he's saying, pull a few strands out of the sheaves, let her scrabble around amongst the sheaves. I'd say people like her in her situation were mistreated, driven off. I can imagine farmers going, I know about Deuteronomy, but you've been here for a day, now get lost. There would have been a lot of cruelty, I think. So that's not the tone that we discover there. And so when Ruth is able to go home with grain, that's another sign of hope for Naomi. Food is like, they say money talks. Well, in the book of Ruth, grain talks. Grain has that kind of significance. It's tangible. For a person who's really hungry, it's right there. You can live. Right? So most of us have never been that hungry, but if you had really been seriously hungry, just a bowl full of actual grain is life. Right? It's right there. So that's the sign that things are moving in the right direction. And Naomi's hope starts to return. So she's a much happier lady late in chapter 2. And then she finds out that Boaz is not just any landowner, he's actually a relative. So remember, Ruth came back thinking she was empty, but now she has a couple of cards in her hand that she didn't realize. Right? She has this relative connection with the potential for care and the potential of maybe reconnection to inheritance. And she has another card in her hand that she hasn't appreciated that we'll notice a little bit later. So Naomi's sounding more positive, and then we get this little fast forward notice. Lots of things connect in Ruth, and so one thing that connects is the end of chapter 1 and the end of chapter 2 both talk about harvests. But the end of chapter 2 mentions the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and just says that Ruth continues to glean in that same field across that period. So we've got to recognise a bit of a fast forward. That's about a 7-week fast forward to get from the barley harvest, which is early in, what is it? I think it's like early summer and then late summer, something like that. It's about 7 weeks apart, the period of Pentecost, I think. And so she gets to glean 2 harvests. So it's a stable situation. There's time for maybe Boaz and Ruth to notice each other, and some words to pass. And so we could imagine, an embryonic relationship as well. But it means the next scene, there's a bit of a fast forward down to that scene. Now, a careful reading of chapters 2 and 3 will reveal that everything happens in sequence the same way. So it starts with Naomi sending Ruth out. Ruth volunteers to go out the first time. Second time, Naomi sends her out. Naomi has a more definite plan this time. And this is for that meeting on the threshing floor. Even the threshing floor is kind of significant. So we're no longer at the harvest stage. We're at the stage of threshing and winnowing. So threshing is getting the husk off the grain, and they would sometimes run animals around and run a millstone over the grain to crack the husk off it and let the kernel, the edible bit, get free. And then when you had a pile of that grain and husks all in a pile on the ground, you had to actually get the husks out. And so then you would, I think the breezes are suitable at that season, and you just toss the grain in the air and let the breeze carry that chaff, the husks, away until you've got pure grain. So I'm imagining the reason why Boaz is on the threshing floor is for security purposes. I think a pile of grain unguarded might have been an obvious target for pillaging. And so I think he's sleeping at the end of the heap and probably a few other workers around for security. But things unfold in a very similar manner because Boaz discovers Ruth both times. He once discovers her in his field, then he discovers her on his floor, and then they have a conversation, and in both cases, Boaz extends his protection over her. And so now it's the protection of potential marriage. The whole scene is kind of quite bold, and there's plenty of reading to do about it. And the real nitty-gritty I'm going to let Jono handle. It's very interesting, though. I think of the whole book on the metaphor of a card game. Okay, and so Naomi starts to really tell Ruth in chapter 3, I think I know how to play this one. And she knows what cards are in the hand, but she knows they have to be brought out in the right order. So if you're a 500 player or anything like that, sometimes it's good to play trump early. Sometimes it's good to hold on to trump and leave them guessing. Sometimes it's good to suggest that you've got some trump when you don't, or suggest you haven't when you have, right? So all that is to say, there might be some reasons why Ruth holds on to trump in chapter 3. okay? I think she has some reasons to hold on to Trump. But Boaz has enough of a sniff of his own good prospects in this chapter to be a highly motivated man. So he sends Ruth home with a lot of grain, I think probably nearly as much as she can carry now. So we've stepped it up from chapter 2. Ruth had sort of enough leftovers for Naomi to eat in chapter 2. Chapter 3, as much as Ruth can possibly carry. And so Naomi just thinks, well, things are getting better and better here. You know, she's brought a wheelbarrow load of grain home this time. The trajectory is clear. Things are getting better and better. And because Naomi knows how this particular card game runs, she says, all you've got to do now, Ruth, is sit tight. This man will see to the completion of this business. Ball's in his court. He's a very motivated tennis player. Right now, we don't have to do anything. We just have to watch it unfold. The complication in the story, of course, was that there was someone else closer, a closer relative with the entitlement to inherit or perpetuate Elimelech's property, Naomi's husband, and also to marry the widow involved, Ruth. And so Boaz can't shortcut that legally. He's got to see through legal process. So it's just interesting in the artistry of the way this is written that the centre 2 chapters are these matching panels, and if you follow the action, they run just in parallel sequence. A lot of the same words are used, and yet it's not a photocopy, is it? It's a different event, but told on the same pattern. That's a little bit of that artistry. So we know things are getting near the culmination when we get to the finale, and the transaction at the city gate where all the legal stuff is done, Boaz plays his cards a little bit too, right? So he actually lets the other rightful heir think that he's going to take the trick. This will be more helpful if you are a card player, but you know about taking tricks, right? And you know, it's sometimes fun to let another player think they're taking the trick, like in a suit that's not Trump, and then you bring out your little trivial Trump card and you take the trick. Boaz does that to this other guy who, interestingly, in the Hebrew, he is referred to as Poloni Almoni. It only happens 3 times in the whole Old Testament, Mr. Poloni Almoni. He sounds like he's from Sicily or somewhere, but actually, that's Hebrew for what's his face. All right? So out comes Mr. What's his face into the story, and it's so unimportant that we know his name that he just gets this kind of fill-in. You know, Poloni Almoni, comes out, and Boaz dangles the card, lets him think he's getting Trump. Oh, I get to inherit some additional property, expand my holdings. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. And Boaz says, and by the way, you've actually got to marry this Moabite woman too, the widow of one of the sons of Elimelech, if you do that. Right, so that's where the actual Trump comes out, because he knows his own family will risk having its inheritance split or diverted if he does that. Boaz knew he wouldn't go for that, but he had to play the cards so that this other guy would think he wanted it and then decide very firmly that he didn't. He had to make sure he didn't take the offer. And so the sequence of the cards matters a great deal. That's the way Boaz plays it out. And so he is left free to marry Ruth by the fact that this other guy has his own family and can't risk the clash of those inheritance rights. So we've really reached the part of the story where things are really sunny, okay? So we think for a long time when we're reading the book of Ruth that Ruth is the central character and it's all about her and it's about her life. And now in the middle, that's about right, because chapter 3, Naomi says, look, we've seen this harvest season through. I think I can set you up. And so Naomi is focused on Ruth in the middle of the book, and that's why she comes up with the meeting at the threshing floor as the mechanism by which she can set Ruth up. But things move in the other direction in chapter 4, and it becomes no longer Ruth's story, but it becomes Naomi's story. The focus goes back onto Naomi. The child, when it's born, is handed into the arms of Naomi. The women who first greeted Naomi when she came home say to Naomi that God's given her a son. It's as if the child's more hers than Ruth's, oddly enough, because it was really Naomi's loss that we were meant to care about the most. Ruth is a very important character, but it's ultimately the story of Naomi's loss and restoration that concerns the book the most. And so she goes from being empty to these overt statements about her now being full again, empty to full. Now, a really fascinating thing that is said there at the end is, Naomi, now she has a male child, highly valued in the society, but what's more valuable to her than even 7 sons, according to the women around? It's this daughter-in-law, right? She is more precious to you than 7 sons. That's what the women say to Naomi, but she hadn't realized. So when she came back from Moab, she said, I've been brought back empty. I went out full. The Lord has brought me back empty. I'm destitute. I'm bereaved. There's nothing in my hand. I've nothing left. But she was not actually right. And that's what despair can do to you, right? You can actually fail to realize when you've lost a lot, you can say, well, let's just call it what it looks like it is. I've lost everything. But Naomi had not lost everything, because she had with her the stout loyalty and the resourcefulness and the industriousness of this really special woman, Ruth, who had come back with her. Naomi already had that in chapter 1. She thought she had nothing, but she was wrong. And sorrow can do that to our perspective. It can actually make us think that all is lost when all is not lost. It took 4 chapters of the book of Ruth for Naomi to realize, she had to be told by this audience of onlookers, well, the most precious thing you've got right now is the thing you had right through the whole story. So I think the book of Ruth is really applicable to us as human beings. This is not one of those books of the Bible where we'll have to struggle for application, struggle for relevance. It's a very human story. It's actually a very feminine story. So it's one of that small set of Old Testament books where the focus is mainly on feminine issues and feminine experience. Some people think maybe it was written by a woman. I don't know. We wouldn't know, right? But it's possible. It's great for taking Hebrew students to, if you want them to learn all of their feminine endings. We have pronoun endings that are masculine and feminine in other languages like Hebrew and Greek. Well, Ruth is a great one to learn all the feminine ones. Almost every pronoun in there is a feminine pronoun. So there's an interesting perspective there for a woman's experience. But it's a very human experience, and it's a very pastoral book. Like, I think it says a lot to the person who has lost a great deal, and it wants to wake us up and say, be careful not to mistake great loss for global loss, for universal loss. When a lot of bad things have happened to you, everything is not jet black, and you actually have to develop an eye for what precious thing God has left in your life that is actually going to be the key. That's going to be the way out. Ruth was that key from very early in the story. So it's a book of hope. And the last thought I want to leave you with in this overview of the book is, what is the basis of hope? We have a reason for not looking at the book of Ruth and saying, well, isn't it nice that things turned out for that lady? She got to be the ancestress of King David, and then in the longer scale, the ancestress of Jesus. So that's great. Ruth went from being a pretty despised outsider from another country, not the people of God, lowest class, having to scrounge for a living. So she starts from the floor socially and climbs her way up. Well, that's a success story. But it's more than just a happy story about someone who lived in the deep past, because another key word, and this is the last little detail I'm going to mention this morning, it's a great Hebrew word called chesed, and it actually expresses like faithful love. It's been given 100 definitions, but I think faithful love works pretty well. This word keeps coming up in the book of Ruth. And at the end of chapter 2, when Naomi sees Ruth come home with grain for the first time, she says, oh, the Lord has not abandoned his faithful love toward the living and the dead. It's his faithful love that is the basis of hope. So if it was just we were reading that someone had a good experience way back in Israel, we go, well, that's kind of an edifying story. I feel a little bit uplifted by that. My story may or may not be like hers. Oh, but what we share with Naomi is that we too are people of God, and we know the God who does not leave his faithful love, right? So when we read about Chesed, when we read about the committed love of God, we're reading about a character trait. We're reading about a principle of the character of God that we can rely on to be true across the ages. And so Naomi's hope is grounded in the fact that God doesn't let his people down. Now, it's not prosperity doctrine, is it? Right? Naomi loses almost all the things that she valued. Her losses are profound. And so if you wanted a book of the Bible to tell you that being a child of God meant that you wouldn't suffer any tragedy, well, this is not that book. Right? It goes nearer to getting you prepared for the fact that being a child of God might mean you do face tragedy. But it does say, hey, your hope in such a profound loss is in this reliable character of God, this unchanging faithfulness. It was there all the time under the surface, and then like new heads of grain, up came the sprouts of new hope because they were planted and grounded in the faithfulness of God. And it took a while, but Naomi in the end recognised that. So it's a fantastic book. I hope your appetite's been whet for it. There are a lot more details that you'll be able to delve into and explore there. But it's a gem, and it's rightfully in our Bibles. So I hope you already begin to sense some of the encouragement that comes from that. Why don't I pray, and then I'll invite, the mob back up. Dear Lord, these stories are about real people and real personal kinds of lives. And we're not just reading about figures of history, we're reading about people who were walking with you, people who, when they blessed each other in your name, meant it. And so we have a connection to them. Lord, I pray that the book of Ruth would live for the Muralbark mob here over these coming weeks and be something that they feel, something they identify with and understand and just feel built up by. And Lord, I'd add a special prayer for anyone whose experience is anything like that of Naomi and Ruth. In a group this size, Lord, I'm sure there are some for whom loss is a recent and a keenly felt reality. And so, Lord, I just pray, we all pray, that anyone in that category would feel true encouragement and the sense that you are not their enemy, that you are not determined to make their life miserable. You haven't chosen them as a target, as Job thought. But there is somewhere in that life, there's a Ruth given to help, and hope is going to sprout once more. I pray that they would feel that as a result of this series. In Christ's name, amen.